Cold Grip, a story by Page Turner 627. Before we start, if you enjoy this content and want to support me, please feel free to like this video and subscribe. The night was heavy, the kind of thick, humid, Philly summer night that sticks to your skin like sweat and gasoline. I was less than 2 weeks away from starting med school at Temple, and this was my last ever shift as an EMT. One last hurrah before I put this life behind me. But I guess the universe had other plans. It always does. It was around 2 a.m. when the call came in. Overdose, Rittenhouse Square. I glanced at my partner Dan and we exchanged tired nods. We were used to OD calls. In this city, they were as frequent as the breath we took. When we arrived, I grabbed the Narcan from the kit, thinking this would be a quick in and out. But as we approached, the scene was wrong. It wasn't just one body, it was two. They were huddled together on the park bench, both motionless. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting an eerie shadow across their pale faces. One was a young guy, mid-20s maybe, his head lolled back against the bench. The other was a girl, just as young, her face buried in his chest. Dan stepped forward, kneeling beside them. "Shit, Priya, they're cold," he muttered, nudging the guy's arm. We're too late. We should have called it then. But I started working on them. They were too far gone though. There was no saving them. Still, we had to try, right? That's what we're trained to do, to save lives. I couldn't take my eyes off the girl. Her skin was the first thing that told me something was wrong. It wasn't just pale from death. It had this sickly, greyish hue that reminded me of the colour of storm clouds just before a tornado. But worse than that were the marks. I knelt beside her, and as I pulled her away from the guy's chest, I saw them. Jagged bite marks dotted her arms, her neck, and her collarbone, as if something had gnawed at her flesh. They weren't clean like an animal attack though. These looked human, the teeth unmistakable, but they had dug in deep, tearing the skin in a grotesque, almost desperate way. Blood had poured around the edges of the wounds, dark and coagulated. It had long dried. I reached for her hand, and that's when her eyes snapped open. I jumped back, my heart pounding. Her grip was ice cold and iron strong. She yanked me forward with unnatural force, her mouth opening in a twisted smile. Her teeth, oh God, they were sharp, too sharp. Dan, help me. Dan turned just as the girl sat up, still clutching my wrist. Her eyes were bloodshot, wide and wild. She snarled like an animal. I tried to put her away, but her grip tightened. Dan grabbed my shoulder, trying to wrench me free, but she was stronger than both of us combined. Get the hell off of her, Dan screamed, reaching for his radio. But before he could call for backup, the guy next to her stirred. His eyes opened too, milky, glazed over, like something dead brought back to life. The girl leaned closer, her breath rancid like rotten meat. "It's so cold," she whispered, her voice raspy and wet. Then she lunged. She bit into my arm. The pain was searing, blood spilling instantly. I screamed and punched her in the face, knocking her backwards, but she barely flinched. Dan swung his flashlight, cracking her across the head. She let go, and I stumbled back, clutching my arm, feeling the warmth of my blood spilling down my wrist. "We need to get out of here," Dan yelled, pulling me to my feet. The guy was on his feet now too, swaying, his head rolling unnaturally. The girl crouched, growling, ready to lunge again. We ran for the ambulance, slamming the doors shut behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, blood soaking the seats. Dan was yelling into the radio, calling for backup, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, watching us, their heads twisted at odd angles, smiles stretching across their faces. "Drive," Dan said breathlessly, his eyes wide with fear. "Just goddamn drive." I floored it, the ambulance tearing down the streets. My arm throbbed with pain, and all I could think about was how close that bite had come to my throat. Despite the treatment, the bite festers, black veins crawling up my arm, skin rotting at the edges. Fever hits hard, but it's not the worst of it. I look in the mirror. My eyes are changing, glassy, bloodshot. Each night I grow colder, and the craving grows stronger. And I can't help but smile